The snow had a way of polishing everything into a brittle, honest silence. It sank softly against my coat and went on its business without asking permission, filing itself along the edges of the walkway, piling on the porch rail in a thin white rim. I remember the dress first, emerald silk that caught the gray light and held it like it was a small, stubborn jewel. I had not worn it in years. I put it on because I wanted to arrive as someone invited, as someone who belonged, not as the tired woman who had folded herself into schedules and bills for decades. My suitcase clicked behind me. My hands were full of neatly wrapped packages, small things I had chosen slowly, things I thought would sit on a shelf or be opened with a laugh. Seasonal lights winked through the windows, warm behind curtains. I could hear muffled voices, a television, the clink of plates. The smell of some festive food drifted out when the door cracked open and then closed again, like a promise. He opened the door with the kind of distracted quickness I had watched him move with since he was a boy. Mark, my son, he had his whole life in his face, the tones and the rhythm of being busy, the practice of polite omission. He took in the dress and the snow with a look that tried not to be anything. He glanced at the packages and then at me, as if he were measuring excess. "You're at the wrong house," he said. The sentence was short and exact, like the lock sliding back into place. I did not fall apart in a cinematic way. There was no dramatic collapse on the step, no public weeping. There were instead a dozen small things trailing behind that phrase: years and late-night shifts, birthday candles blown out on cheap cakes in drafty apartments, a Buick held together with duct tape and prayers, summers spent sewing costumes and winter nights reading until the children slept. I felt them slide through me like objects on a conveyor belt, memory after memory, ordinary loyalty, invisible labor. The door shut. I stood on the step and watched the seam of warm light seal itself. Inside, a muffled laugh. Outside, snow. My suitcase sat by the stoop like an accusation, and also like a truth. I had come fully, and I had been turned away. If you want to hear how I turned that door into a beginning, stay with me. This is my story. Not the clean, triumphant headline people sometimes mistake for a biography of willpower, but the slow, stubborn accumulation of choices that finally tipped into one deliberate act. I was 25 when he died. I remember that detail the way others remember the exact weather of a funeral. Sunlight too sharp for the day, the sense of every ordinary thing rearranged by absence. I had been young, in love with a life that split open. There were 2 small children and a job with long hours. There was a house that needed fixing and a pocketbook that would not hold a new country. Widowhood did not come with a manual, only a roster of immediate needs: diapers, rent, the grocery list. I worked nights and afternoons. I learned to be 2 places at once, physically present for a child's scraped knee and mentally present on a ward where someone else's breath might stop if I looked away. I learned how to go without. I learned how to make a plan and then carry it home in the pockets of an old coat. There were sacrifices that felt like a promise. Give up your evenings now so your children have a future, and sacrifices that later felt like debt. I put both hands into that work for 33 years of mothering and then 32 years of nursing. The 2 did not always align neatly. Sometimes the hospital clock ran into school recitals, and sometimes a night shift bled into a missed visit. I learned to stretch time the way one stretches a thin sweater so it will not tear. When my children grew, I did not stop. I thought the work would change, evolve into visits and laughter and grandchildren. I thought patience would be repaid in easy dinners and a room at the table when I came to town. For a long while it was that way, the slow accrual of ordinary gratitude. But small things began to shift, and because they were small at first, I mistook them for nothing. Birthday calls became texts. Invitations came with the caveat, "Do you mind sitting the earlier slot?" or the offhand, "You can use the guest room when you visit." 1,000 little concessions that, like the snow, built up at the edges until they formed a bank I could not see through. Venmo notes for groceries or gas showed up, and then faded without a thank you. Requests were direct and transactional. Can you send $1,000 this month? Always the same amount, a round figure I began to expect. I told myself that money was practical. I told myself love shouldn't be a ledger. It added up. Years accumulate like sediment. You cannot always feel the pressure until one day you strike bedrock. The erosion was quieter than I imagined, a series of tiny removals of intimacy, not asking how my day was, not holding a menu so I could pick first, choosing a vacation I was not invited to attend, or not calling when I was in the hospital with a sprained ankle. There were explanations, work, schedules, busy lives, the logistics of a family stretching out in different directions. But explanations do not put a hand on your shoulder when the door closes. I remember the time Mark texted, asking if he could come by to pick something up, our old chest of drawers. He wrote while I was at work, a short message with no greeting. Is the chest still in the garage? Need it for the spare room. I answered because I am habitual. I want to be helpful. He came and left, and on the way out, his van full, he called to say, Thanks, Mom. It'll be good for the kids. No visit to sit, no time to talk. Later that week, I found a photo of a brand new console table on his Instagram, and my small giveaway piece sat comfortably staged in the corner. There were kinder moments, to be sure. Sophie, my daughter, called me in the early days when her voice still broke at the small things. Little Emma and Noah came by with their sticky hands and bright, earnest questions. They loved me in the way children love, big and uncomplicated. But affection can be present in fits and starts, and we all make the trade-offs we think are necessary. The important part of this is not to make them villains. They are not. They are my children, and there is compassion for the exhaustion of parenthood and the pull of busy lives. There is also recognition that habit can harden into neglect. Giving can become an invisible expectation, and expectations can shadow any ordinary gratitude until, like winter, it becomes impossible to mistake the cold for weather. So I stand on the step in my emerald dress because rights matter. I believed, perhaps foolhardily, that my attendance would be a thread woven back into the cloth of family. Maybe I wanted to remind them of me the way I used to be, proud in a dress, carrying a suitcase and small, careful gifts, an idea of mother that was more than errands and autopay. I had patched myself together to show up, and those gloves I wore were not armor, but an offering. When Mark said, "You're at the wrong house," I remember the exact direction of his eyes. They veered to the road as if he could find there a throng of excuse. He did not reach to steady me. He did not invite me in to warm my hands by the fire. There was a phrase that slipped later into an explanation from Elaine, my daughter-in-law, a sentence I could not forget. She thinks the money she sends every month buys her a seat at the table. I replayed that sentence on the bed of a hotel that night until its edges softened. There was something in it that hurt, partly because it was true, and partly because it was not the whole truth. The money had always been practical. Rent, a margin for emergencies, a cushion for the unexpected. It was not the currency I had hoped would purchase belonging. No amount of cash does that. But the accusation suggested my motives were simplistic, that maybe everything I had done boiled down to an attempt to buy affection. I had hoped, perhaps quietly and without saying it, that my presence and my help would be reciprocated by care in ways that money cannot buy. When the door closed, I walked a few blocks away under the holiday lights and pulled my coat tighter. I did what many do when something unbelievable happens. I breathed through it and then admitted to myself that I had been collecting small cuts for a long time. I checked into a hotel because I needed a place to think without interruption. I did not cry then, not in buckets, only a small, steady ache that felt like a bruise under the sternum. I made a cup of room service tea and sat with my hands around it, warm in a way that had nothing to do with the kettle. I opened my phone and found the list of scheduled payments. There it was, a standing bank transfer, $1,000, an invisible thread leaving my account each month for reasons that had begun as necessity and had quietly become habit. I stared at that number the way one looks at a photograph of a place you have not visited in years. It holds both memory and distance. It felt like an old map of my life, a map I had drawn and then failed to revise as roads changed. I did not do it for spite. I did not make a theatrical gesture meant to punish. I thought instead of balance, of whether my giving was serving anyone other than keeping me safe in a way that had nothing to do with dignity. I tapped the options and canceled the automatic transfer. My hands did not shake. The screen confirmed the change. A small formal notification, standing order canceled, blinked back at me like a neutral witness. Sleep came that night like a small, unearned mercy. Not the kind of sleep that erases pain, but the kind that allows clarity to surface. I dreamed of the Buick my husband and I had once driven with the heater on the blink and a child's jacket drying on the back seat. I dreamed of small hands reaching for a cookie, and when dawn leaked in through the hotel curtains, the air felt different. Not lighter, perhaps, but less crowded with obligation. The next days were not a cinematic rush of liberatory acts. There was no immediate catharsis. There was instead a succession of practical decisions that felt like packing a life into boxes and labeling it. This is mine. This is ours. This is what I am finished giving without reciprocity. I called the hospital and scheduled a meeting with my supervisor to discuss stepping back. 32 years of shifts had given me a competence I could not deny, and a tiredness I finally respected. I had kept a ledger of my body's limits for too long. I told my supervisor plainly that I was considering giving notice. He asked if I had thought about going part-time or taking a sabbatical. I had thought about it. I had also thought about leaving a place where nights had been filled with other people's grief, and where my own life had become the margin of my shifts. I did not make grand speeches. I told him, I need to step away and see if there is more of me to find. He paused, perhaps feeling the weight of the roster, perhaps reading the near certainty that hospitals resist change. He offered help, paperwork, a plan. I accepted assistance because practical kindness is useful. I set a date, not to punish anyone, but to mark a boundary I had not been willing to name before. I called Diane, my sister, who after all these years was my confessor and my complicity. We have always been the kind of sisters who exchange boxes of jam and small mercies. She answered on the second ring. "Are you okay?" she asked with the blunt tenderness of someone who had seen my life unfold in real time. I told her what had happened at the doorstep. There were sounds on the other end, a quiet intake and then a firmness. "Come," she said. "Pack what you need. We'll put the rest in storage. You are coming to my place until you figure out the rest." Packing up a life is supposed to be an act of dismantling. In practice, it turned into a rearranging of priorities. I found old letters from my husband, brittle and inked in his hand, and I put them in a blue shoebox. I folded the emerald dress carefully and placed it in the top of the suitcase like a pact I had made with myself. I did the things people do when they are deciding to leave. I called a lawyer to ask about paperwork for downsizing the estate. Nothing decisive, merely practical queries. I made a list of things I would keep close and things I could let go of. There is a kind of grief in parting with the pile of photographs that show a life built of increments. It is also oddly freeing. And then I did something that felt like a small, bright rebellion. I booked a one-way ticket to Thailand. Choosing Thailand was not random. For years I collected images in the margins of my life, a documentary about a market with piles of mangoes, a friend's postcard of beaches at dusk, a book a patient at the hospital had recommended. I had a vague, recurring sense of travel as a way to refill. It was not a flight to escape, but a flight to arrive somewhere unknown and allow myself to be remade, slowly, without anyone's timetable pressing into my skin. Booking the ticket felt both obscene and necessary. There are expectations attached to the elder mother, the widow who has kept the hearth burning through sickness and seasons. Those expectations include a certain permanence. But permanence can calcify into a demand for availability that erases a person into the role of resource. I wanted to wake up for myself for a while. The ticket was one way because I wanted no return date hovering like an ultimatum. I wanted the pressure removed so I could breathe. When the first bank notification arrived, an alert that a transfer had been halted, panic filled their phones and, through them, my life. Sophie called first, voice high and imploring. "Mom, what happened? Did something happen with your bank?" She was concerned in the way children are when the rules change. "We didn't get it, Mom. We were counting on it for a repair." "I know," I said. I decided to stop the automatic transfers. There was a pause that felt like a hinge. "Why? Why would you do that?" "Because I wanted to say, because I had to say, because I'm starting to do things for me." But I did not say it in that moment. Instead, I listened. Sophie was practical. She spoke of bills and of how tight things had become since a layoff at Mark's company. I offered what small help I could that month, an immediate transfer to cover the repair, a patching, a kindness that was honest and present. But I did not reopen the standing order. I repeated that detail because it mattered. This was not about spite. It was about stopping something I no longer felt healthy to continue without reciprocity. They panicked. Panic is a polite cloak for shock and embarrassment. Mark sent a message that first night, shorter than their voices had been when they were small. Sophie called again. There was a message from Elaine that came with the shape of hurt, a question about whether my action meant I intended to cut them off. Mark called the hotel that night. I let him speak into the voicemail. He left a message that stitched together words like, "Come on," and "reconsider," and "it hurts us too." Worry. There was a quickness in his worry that felt like my old life seeing its own neglect. He wanted me back in a role that fit his convenience. When he found me, it was not at the house, but at the hotel desk where I was checking out. He stood in the corridor, a man caught between anger and bewilderment. He looked tired in that way people do when they have to carry a life unadorned by softness. He wanted explanation and perhaps forgiveness in equal measure. "You can't just stop sending money," he said, the sentence shaped by the bristle of someone who felt both entitled and scared. "We thought you would always—" "I thought I would always be a helper," I said. "I did that for a long time. It's not that I won't help at all. It's that I decided some of it should be for me now. I'm not ending everything. I am choosing what I need." His face changed in the space between the words. A child of mine and a man he is. He needed my availability because he had always relied on it. That reliance had calcified into expectation. He reached behind him for an argument and found smaller hands, the ones I was used to holding. There was no booming accusation that broke me. There was instead the bland bewilderment of someone finding family roles altered. "You're just going to leave?" he asked. "Yes," I said. Not to wound, but to be honest. "I am going to travel. I need to see if there is more of me to meet." "Why Thailand?" he floundered, as if a geography could explain a decision about selfhood. I told him about mango markets and a patient's handwritten recipe, about the image of a sunrise on a shore that had lodged like a splinter. I did not invite him to understand everything. Understanding is not always required. Respect is. He looked at me as if trying to read the ticket in my hands like one reads a promise. I thought of the years of caregiving and of how, in offering everything, I had silently taught them to assume my presence. To step away was to allow them room to learn to manage without me. It was also to give myself permission to be curious. That is the balance I was learning to preserve. Compassion without erasure of my own needs. Sophie cried in the phone call that followed our face-to-face. She said the word abandoned, and then apologized for how small it sounded when the practicality of life was the thing that strained. "We're not trying to make you feel small, Mom," she said. "We just need help." "I know," I said. "I understand needing help. This is not about never helping again. This is about me starting to do things that are for my life. You can call me. You can come to visit. I will help when it's reasonable. But I'm not going to be the automatic line that smooths every problem for you." There is a tenderness to those late conversations. They are not the fire and brimstone of melodrama. They are a messy, human sorting out. Sophie and Mark are my children. They are human. They are sometimes thoughtless. They are sometimes overwhelmed. They are not monsters. They are people I love. Loving them did not mean I had to stay a feature in their lives that consumed my identity. I remember the packing of last things, the careful folding of the emerald dress back into its box, as if tucking a secret away. I said goodbye to my neighbors in the building where I had lived for years. I told them I was taking some time, not a long explanation, but a truthful one. The door shut on my apartment for the last time with a reverence I had not expected. There is a lightness in leaving that is not absence, but possibility. The weight of other people's needs had been real, but it was not the only real thing. There were also mornings where I woke up and did not plan my day around someone else's appointments, afternoons with blank pages. The airport was bright and busy. People moved like a living clock. I watched a young couple in matching jackets laugh over coffee and thought about how young love folds a future into the present in a way that can feel dizzying. I felt both the sting of loss for the life I had known and an excited, almost childlike curiosity about a life not yet fully written. The plane rose and the ground fell away with the familiar gravity of endings and beginnings. My heart thudded quietly and steadily in my chest. People talk about reinvention as if it is a dramatic remaking. For me, it was mostly small acts, ordering something unfamiliar off a menu and liking it, walking without having to look at a clock, speaking to strangers about small things that had nothing to do with family obligations. My days were not filled with constant euphoria. I had moments of loneliness, of missing little rituals, of wondering what would happen next. But I also had days of exquisite ordinary joy, a market with fruit I had never seen arranged like colored jewels, an afternoon spent watching waves erase words in the sand, a temple bell that was only a sound and nothing else. And there was a quiet satisfaction in not answering the phone in the way I used to. Not every urgency is equally urgent. There is a skill in triage of the heart. The world did not collapse because one line of money stopped. Things reconfigured. Relationships acted as if they were elastic, tightening and sometimes loosening, readjusting to new tensions. Letters came, emails and tentative texts, some angry, some pleading, some apologetic. Lifetimes do not change in a day. My children, like people everywhere, took their own time to see what my absence taught them. There were meals I missed and birthdays that felt like test pieces. There were also visits where we sat and laughed like people who had been given a chance to relearn one another. You do not know the shape of new territory until you have the space to walk around in it. I do not want this to read as a triumphant story of getting even. That is not it. My life has been filled with work and pain and love and boredom and tiny mercies. Leaving was not a punishment. It was a refusal to let the role of giver erase the rest of who I am. It was a quiet reclaiming of time and interest. I went to Thailand and came back with a head full of small, luminous things, recipes written on paper with stains of tea, a friend who taught me to bargain with a smile, a sunset that lived itself into me like light. When I return to the city, people ask, sometimes with an almost guilty curiosity, was it worth it? I think about the months before the doorstep and the months after. The cash transfers changed nothing in the moral ledger of my love. What changed was something quieter, but more meaningful. I stopped being measured by my willingness to be available at all hours, and started being valued for the whole person I am. My children learned slowly that mothers are not inexhaustible. They learned that relationships require effort, and that the absence of an automatic line can be an invitation to grow. Now, months later, we have conversations that are more honest. Mark will call and ask about my latest small adventure, and unlike before, I say, "I'll be in town next month. Let me know if you want to make something of it." He will sometimes look surprised, and then he will answer with a plan. Sophie will still call about the practical with a tone of economy, but she now begins her calls with a question that is not transactional. "How are you really?" There is a gentle rhythm to visits now. They are not the old pattern of me arriving and being absorbed into a host of fix-it tasks. We meet as people. That is the real change. It is not perfect. We still have moments where old habits haunt us, where my boundaries are tested by emergency, and old reflexes want to pick up the slack. But I have learned to say no without guilt, and yes with intention. When I tell this story to anyone who will listen, usually women my age or caregivers with the same tired shoulders, I try to say it without prescriptions. Do not take my actions as a universal remedy. For some families, financial support is essential, and there is no shame in continuing to give. This was my decision, and it fit the life I had lived and the needs I had. I do not offer a one-size-fits-all formula. What I offer is this: an argument for attention to yourself that is plain and non-heroic. Take small, concrete steps that preserve your dignity. Notice the erosion before it becomes a cliff. You do not owe anyone the version of yourself that sacrifices all possibility for their comfort. There is a day I remember clearly, months after I first left, when Emma, my granddaughter, pulled my hand toward a box of crayons and insisted I draw with her. I sat on the floor, and her small arm leaned into mine with trust that did not expect anything but presence. There was a kind of redemption in that simple closeness, the knowledge that you can be present and not be the entire scaffold of someone's life. The children can find their footing when the scaffolding changes. They might wobble. They might learn to stand differently. But the kind of giving that eats you alive is not a loving thing to model. Far better to be present in a way that teaches independence and mutual care. If there is a final thing to say about finding yourself late in life, it is this: freedom is quieter than we imagine. It is not fanfare. It is the sound of your own footsteps in the morning when you realize you are not running to someone else's schedule. It is the peace of a single decision made in an ordinary hotel room. It is the courage to book a ticket with no return date because you want to learn what you might become. I am not the same woman who stood on that porch in the emerald dress. Neither are my children. The narrative has shifted. There have been hard conversations, awkward apologies, times when the ache returns like weather. But there is also the steadying knowledge that I am not just a resource to be tapped. I am a person with a past and a future, entitled to curiosity and rest. If any of this touches a place in you, if you've stood on a threshold of your own and wondered which way to go, I would love to hear your story. Share it below or watch another story about reinvention. Sometimes the quiet courage of others helps us find our own. For now, I keep my passport in a drawer, and sometimes I take it out and smooth the page where the stamp lives, like a talisman. The door I watched close that New Year's Day was painful, but it was also a hinge. It opened to a way of living that would include me as well as them. That simple change of being invited back into your own life is the most generous thing I have learned to give myself.